the tax incidence and the amount of deadweight loss all depends, as I alluded to before, on the elasticity of demand. So when demand is really inelastic, then quantity demanded doesn't respond very much to a change in price. If the demand is elastic, then the quantity demanded does respond to changes in price, responds more responsive to a change in price. The more inelastic demand is, the greater the burden on consumers of a tax, and the smaller the deadweight loss. So before we look at this on a graph and think about how it works out sort of mathematically, you can think about the story behind this. When demand is inelastic, it means that the consumers are not very responsive to a change in price. They're not going to change their behavior, their buying behavior, their purchasing behavior when the price changes. So if you're a producer in this market and the government levies a tax on you, what do? You increase the price. You pass that tax on to consumers. Why? Because they have inelastic demand, because they've shown through their inelasticity, through their unresponsiveness to a price change, that they're willing to pay a higher price for the product. If they're willing to pay a higher price and not disappear, in other words, the quantity demanded doesn't change very much when you increase the price, then that's what you do when you get taxed. You increase the price. You pass the tax on to the consumers. So the more inelastic demand is, the greater the tax burden is going to be on the consumers, because the more they're willing to pay, the more they're willing to bear that tax burden. So here it is on a graph. In the most extreme case, if we have perfectly inelastic demand, prior to the tax, we would have a price and quantity right there where supply and demand cross, and our producer surplus is the space between the supply curve and the price, and consumer surplus is the space between the demand curve and the price, or all the space above the price, right? Say there's a tax, it shifts the supply curve to the left. Now what happens? Now we see an increase in price, but not a change at all in quantity. So what has happened? This amount of money goes to the government, right? The amount of the tax times the number of products sold, right? So if it's a $1 tax per minute of phone service, then the number of minutes of phone service times $1, that'd be really steep for phone service, but bear with me, just an example, then that's how much money goes to the government. How much is the tax times how many things were taxed, right? So it's this rectangle, height times width, and the producer surplus is still the same triangle, the space between the price the producer actually receives and the supply curve. And here, note, you go back to the old supply curve for measuring producer surplus, right, at the end, because the old supply curve, or the old demand curve if it's a tax on the demanders, is what really shows your real willingness to sell prior to the tax. So the producer surplus is the same, and the consumers are the ones who bore the entire tax in this case. So the producer recognizes that they're in a market with really inelastic demand. They get taxed. They pass the entire amount of the tax on to the consumers through increased prices. Why? Because they can. Because demand is so inelastic. So why would the government want to tax a good with almost perfectly inelastic demand? These are ideal goods for governments to tax, because it means there's no substitution if there's inelastic demand. So it ensures a steady tax revenue. Folks are going to continue to purchase the thing no matter what the price is, no matter how high the tax is. Purchase will not change very much. Thus, there's little or no deadweight loss. So you get a lot of tax revenue and you didn't have to give up much in terms of efficiency in the market. No deadweight loss. So why do we tax cigarettes instead of Brussels sprouts? It's because if you tax Brussels sprouts, people would stop eating Brussels sprouts. Cigarettes are something that has more of an addictive quality to it and has a more inelastic demand, and so taxing cigarettes increases revenues more without decreasing number of transactions and creating deadweight loss. Notice how that changes if demand is a little more elastic. So here is our downward sloping demand curve now. It's not perfectly inelastic. It's just somewhat inelastic or somewhat elastic. And prior to the tax, we have our typical consumer and producer surplus triangles. Now we get a tax. Now what do we have? Notice this green area is the amount of money that goes to the government. This is the tax revenue, right? It's the amount of the tax, so the amount that the supply curve shifted, the amount of the tax, times the number of transactions that occur with that tax, right? That tells us how much money the government gets. Where is the consumer surplus in this case? It's the difference between the price the consumers actually pay and what they were willing to pay. So it's the difference between the price up here that the consumers pay after the tax and their demand curve. The producer surplus, on the other hand, is the difference between the price down here, which is the actual price the producer receives after paying the tax. So remember that there's this gap between what the consumer actually pays and the producer actually receives, right? So there's going to be a gap between the consumer surplus and the producer surplus when there's a tax. And so the producer surplus is the space between what the producers actually receive and their supply curve. None of this is considered lost surplus. Yes, we have a decrease in producer surplus. Yes, we have a decrease in consumer surplus, and we have this block here. What is that? That's government money. That's government surplus. It's still considered surplus. It, in theory, would come back to the producers and consumers through government services, right? So that's not considered lost money. This little yellow triangle is where we've lost money or happiness or surplus, right? This little yellow triangle is what over here it was consumer and producer surplus. Now it's nobody's surplus. It's lost surplus because of a reduction in number of transactions. If we go to the other extreme where demand is perfectly elastic, it's horizontal, then we would see the other extreme for the tax incidence, right? So producer surplus is all of the space between the price, which just happens to equal the demand curve in this case, and the supply curve. Where is the consumer surplus? There is none, because the consumer surplus would be the difference between the price actually paid and the demand curve. In this case, since the demand curve is flat, it equals the price. So there's no space between the demand curve and the price in this case. There's no consumer surplus when demand is perfectly elastic. What happens with a tax? Supply curve shifts. There's the amount that goes to the government. Who paid it? The producer paid all of the tax in this case. Why? Because there's no way they could pass any of that on to their consumers without losing them all. Because that's the definition of perfectly elastic demand. If you try to change the price, then the quantity demanded goes straight to zero. Right? So because there's elastic demand, the producers had to bear the entire tax incidence. They couldn't pass any of the tax on to the consumers. And there's our deadweight loss. What used to be producer surplus, and now is no one's surplus because we have a reduction in quantity of transactions. So the comparison here, if demand is perfectly inelastic, the burden of the tax falls on consumers. There's no deadweight loss. As demand becomes less inelastic or more elastic, the tax burden starts to fall more and more on producers, and there is deadweight loss. If demand is perfectly elastic, the burden of the tax falls completely on the producers, and there's a larger deadweight loss. And the story here is because why? Because when demand is inelastic, the demanders are willing to pay the tax, so we let them. When demand is inelastic, when the demand is elastic, the demanders are not willing to pay the tax. They'll go away. They don't want to buy it if it costs any more. And so the producer has to bear the burden of the tax if they want to keep their customers around. You think about what would happen if we varied elasticity of supply as well as elasticity of demand. Compare the elasticity of demand with elasticity of supply and think about who would bear the most of the tax. And the answer is whoever's willing to. Whichever side of the market is most inelastic is the side of the market that is going to bear the most of the tax incidence. Because remember, an inelastic supply or demand curve says that that side of the market, that producer if it's supply, or that consumer if it's demand, is willing to pay the tax and not change their quantity. So whoever's willing to pay more of the tax, whoever has the more inelastic supply or demand, is the one who will bear the most of the burden.